Well, thank you, worship team, and for each person who was baptized and wrote just fabulous testimonies. I'm with Aaron. Like this morning was incredible, seeing the three of them get baptized, and if there's anything I'd really love for each of you to leave with today, it's just seeing God work in the lives of disparate individuals in unique ways and in different testimonies, but he works. And we sung about it. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty. There's the throne room scene from Isaiah 6 and then echoed in Revelation chapter 5. And the reason we are singing that is because behold him, the Lamb who was slain. And what a great testimony to that in these testimonies this morning. And so I just love, even if you ignore everything I say today, just leaving with that, I think, is something to take home. Now, before I get going, I had someone come up to me afterwards and complain's too strong of a word, but say I wasn't clear on something. And so I'm going to say the word coalette a bunch. And where that comes from is actually one of the very first verses in Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes chapter 1 is how he introduces himself. The words of the teacher. That word teacher is coalette. So that's why we refer to the author of Ecclesiastes as coalette, because that's how he chooses to introduce himself. So just so you're tracking, that's what I mean by coalette. Often when I'm preparing for these sorts of sermons, this will become as no surprise to many of you. The first trip I do is I head over to the Queen's Library. And the Queen's Library has a wonderful selection of biblical commentaries, monographs, academic resources, and I go get a big stack of them and take them home with me and spend the next couple months just trying to read through as much as I can. And normally I'm blessed in that the commentators all agree with each other for the most part, and then disagree on some niggly details, which I can either gloss over or pick the one that's the most compelling to me. In this chapter, we have the unfortunate occurrence of none of the commentators agreeing with any of the other commentators and all saying different things and leaving poor math brain, black and white Calvin very confused about what he's supposed to say. So this sermon has been a work in progress, been trying to wrestle with it for the last couple months. And what I'm saying here today is where I've arrived right now. I'm not claiming any sort of dogmatism here. I'm simply saying this is where I've arrived right now, and so I'd ask for your grace and your patience as I work through this and try and explain what I've gotten from this text and what I think is trying to be said. I love how biblical commentator Michael Fox puts it. Reading Coelette is not a once-for-all effort. The book is like a mountain that reveals new shape and colors as you approach it from different angles. And so I hope you get to see a different color and a different shape this morning, and that it will be helpful to you as you consider this book. Our specific text this morning is going to be the book of Ecclesiastes chapter 6, and we're going to start at verse 10, and then we're going to work through chapter 7 up to verse 14. But before I begin, just a side note, ancient scribes used to mark off verse 9, or verse 10, as the halfway point. So it's the halfway point both in terms of the number of verses, but also numerically it's pretty close to the halfway, but it's also halfway in terms of the themes that it's speaking of. Well, sort of. It's hard to really give clear-cut themes for each chapter in Ecclesiastes, but I think for our purposes, seeing 6 verse 10 and 12 as part of what's being said in 7 is helpful. And so we'll start there and we'll read just the last 3 verses of chapter 6. Whatever exists has already been named, and what humanity is has been known. No one can contend with someone who is stronger. The more the words, the less the meaning, and how does that profit anyone? For who knows what is good for a person in life during the few and meaningless days they pass through like a shadow? Who can tell them what will happen under the sun after they are gone? And so keep those ideas in mind and just glance down to 13 and 14 in chapter 7. Consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he has made crooked? When times are good, be happy. But when times are bad, consider this. God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore, no one can discover anything about their future. I've read these two in conjunction because they form what is called an inclusio. It's Latin for inclusion, and the idea to keep in mind is a sandwich. On a sandwich, you have two pieces of bread, typically cut from the same loaf, and in between them is some content that is being sandwiched. And the purpose of the analogy is both slices of bread are normally the same substance. They're the same from the same loaf. They look the same, and they're forming together and bringing things together in a cohesive whole. And it's easy to see how 6:10 through 12 and 7:13 and 14 do this. They are basically saying the same thing. Their substance is the same. And that substance, again, isn't necessarily that difficult to see. In 6 verse 10, whatever exists has already been named, and what humanity is has been known. And so there's this subtle nod to Genesis chapter 1, this idea that God gave Adam the right to name the animals. But God is in control, and God is the creator, is the more the idea. And we cannot access the mind of God, and we cannot control what God is going to do. And as such, it is senseless to give advice. That is basically what Kohelet is trying to get across. That if you don't know what's going to happen, who are you to tell someone what to do? And so that's what he means here by the more the words, the less the meaning, and how does that profit anyone? You're just talking. You don't know what you're talking about, you're just talking. But he's got something a little bit more nuanced in mind than just not giving advice. There's some more depth to this that we need to go looking for. For who knows what is good for a person in life during the few and meaningless days? Meaningless, that word's popped up a few times. And this idea of life being meaningless is really important to Kohelet. He's going to link it to if God is in control and I can't access God and I can't know what he's going to do, then how is there any meaning or any purpose in life at all? And that's the constant conclusion. Vanity of vanities. It's just the chasing after the wind. It's frivolous. And this idea of connecting the unknown with a lack of meaning and a lack of purpose is very common. A very famous example of this is given in Shakespeare. In the play Macbeth, Macbeth is in his fortress, in his castle, and the English army is approaching this castle, and Macbeth is looking back at his life filled with just horrible acts, and he determines that he's going to go out and he's going to fight the English, and he will win. But then a servant comes along and gives him the news that his queen has passed away. And he gives this very famous speech in Act 5. Life's but a walking shadow, a poor player that struts and frets his hour upon the stage and then is heard no more. It is a tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Do you hear the similarities there in that last line to Ecclesiastes? Signifying nothing. Somehow this sense that we don't know what's going to happen and we can't control it, and so we're just kind of being pulled blindly along here in Shakespeare by chance or in Kohelet by God's actions, leads to the conclusion, therefore, that what we're doing signifies nothing. It's meaningless. It's just a grasping after the wind. And this is the philosophical framework that is in the background of this text, and it's important to figure out and to hear because it's gonna keep going throughout. But once we've got the philosophical framework, we can move on to verse 12 and see the questions that are going to form the content of chapter 7. And so in verse 12, we have, for who knows what is good for a person in life during the few and meaningless days they pass through like a shadow. And then you can hear it answered in verse 13 of chapter 7. Consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he has made crooked? It's play on words there, straighten what he has made crooked. I can't explain that. That doesn't make sense to me. So, of course, there will be no one who can possibly explain how something is straightened and crooked at the same time. It's a play on words. So, of course, there's no one who can do that. And then the second question, who can tell them what will happen under the sun after they are gone? Who is going to tell us about the future? And the answer is now given in verse 14. Therefore, no one can discover anything about their future. And so we need to keep in mind as we work through chapter 7 that there's two questions given that will set it up, and we're expecting negative answers to both of them. Who can understand what's happening right now? No one. And who can tell us what's going to happen in the future? No one. So that's the context, and hopefully will be of some help as we work through chapter 7. And so let's read chapter 7 and verse 1, and we're going to go all the way down to verse 14. I won't have time to go verse by verse through the whole thing, but we'll just get a good ways down. A good name is better than fine perfume, and the day of death better than the day of birth. It is better to go to a house of mourning than to go to a house of feasting, for death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart. Frustration is better than laughter, because a sad face is good for the heart. The heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. It is better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than to listen to the song of fools. Like the crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of fools. This too is meaningless. Extortion turns a wise person into a fool, and a bribe corrupts the heart. The end of a matter is better than its beginning, and patience is better than pride. Do not be quickly provoked in your spirit, for anger resides in the lap of fools. Do not say, "Why were the old days better than these?" For it is not wise to ask such questions. Wisdom, like an inheritance, is a good thing, and benefits those who see the sun. Wisdom is a shelter, as money is a shelter, but the advantage of knowledge is this: wisdom preserves those who have it. Consider what God has done. Who can straighten what he has made crooked? When times are good, be happy, but when times are bad, consider this: God has made the one as well as the other. Therefore, no one can discover anything about their future. Well, let's get a start. Let's crack on trying to understand what is being said in, admittedly, a rather confusing selection of Proverbs. So let's start at verse 1 and see where we go. A good name is better than fine perfume. Seems reasonable to me that chasing after a good reputation is a better pursuit than looking for things which are just going to mask, which are going to cover up or are going to form a facade. It's better to have a good name and a good reputation than to cover things up. But hang on. What did he just finish saying in 6 verse 12? For who knows what is good for a person in life? Or put it this way, who knows what is better for a person? A good name is better than fine perfume. How can those two sentences exist after each other? Isn't he removing his right to say 7 verse 1 by saying that no one knows what's better? We'll leave that uncomfortable question and move on. Hopefully some clarity will be reached. And the day of death better than the day of birth. Does anyone here, and be honest, was anyone here rather be at a funeral than in the hospital where a mom's just given birth to a new baby? Crickets. Nobody would. We all want to be there and see the excitement of new birth and see the joy of the mother and see the joy of the father as they bring in new birth. We wouldn't rather be at a funeral. So what could he possibly be saying? I'm not even sure I agree with him if we take this sort of blasé approach to what he's saying. Let's step back and let's backtrack and try and figure out where he's coming from and then figure out where he's going with what he's saying. So recall, we looked at the inclusio structure. For who knows what is good for a person in life, and we're expecting an answer coming that's going to be negative. During the few and meaningless days they pass through like a shadow. That's not just a gloss to kind of make things more emphatic. This is an important theme for Ecclesiastes and Ecclesiastes. If you'd been here when Micah was preaching on chapter 4, the idea of death kept popping up over and over and over and over again. Death is part of the quintessential framework for the author of Ecclesiastes. He's seeing everything through death, and specifically, the declaration that things are vain is done because he's seeing his death at the end. Why would I bother toiling? Why would I bother working if I'm just going to die? It's making everything pointless and meaningless. That's the framework that he's coming out of. And to me, this is where it gets really exciting, because Ecclesiastes is actually part of a much broader sort of philosophical tradition that views it. If you're a nerd on these sorts of things like me, the actual expression is he'd be an existential nihilist. And it includes some of the great thinkers of time, including Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer and Albert Camus. And Albert Camus writes in the transition from World War I to World War II, an incredibly dark period of history for Europe. the reign of Nazism is coming in, and he writes in the myth of Sisyphus, he writes the following thing. Thinking of the future, establishing aims for oneself, having preferences, all this presupposes a belief in freedom, even if one occasionally ascertains that one doesn't feel it. And so he's saying the idea that I am in control, that I have purpose and that I have meaning, is somehow tied to the belief that I have freedom. I have a freedom to do what I want, therefore I can find purpose for myself. He goes on. But at that moment, I am well aware that that higher liberty, that freedom to be, which alone can serve as a basis for truth, does not exist. Death is there as the only reality. After death, the chips are down. I am not even free either to perpetuate myself, but a slave, and above all, a slave without hope of an eternal revolution without recourse to contempt. I just want to focus on that first line there. Death is there as the only reality. This is the framework that Kohelet is working on. It is mathematically certain that we will die. It is the only thing in life that is certain. And certainly there's a lot more atheistic, agnostic edge that's present in this quote, we have to admit. But the point is still the same. Death is there as the only reality. And Kohelet believes that if you are wise, that is the place you will start, with the fact you are going to die and build your wisdom out of that. And so with that in mind, let's try and tackle 7 verse 1 again. A good name is better than fine perfume. Sounds an awful lot like Proverbs 22 verse 1, which is it would have been an important book for Kohelet. Proverbs 22 verse 1, a good name is more desirable than great riches. To be esteemed is better than silver or gold. But he's going to nuance this view. When do you get to enjoy your good reputation? When is your good reputation secure, never to be tarnished again? When you die. How then can you enjoy your good reputation? That thing that you've worked so hard for, that thing that you fought adversity, that thing that you fought toil for, your whole life you've worked for it, and the moment it's secure, you're dead. What was the point of doing all of that? And furthermore, if life is all about toil and if life is about fighting absurdity, it's rather depressing. And so in that case, of course, the day of death is going to be better than the day of birth, because the day of birth marks the start of the fight against absurdity, the fight against meaninglessness. And we get confirmation that we're looking at things the right way when we get to verse 2 and he says, "For death is the destiny of everyone. The living should take this to heart." I was speaking with a couple after the first service, and they were sharing how that really rung true for them at a funeral they were at this week. And I'm sure all of us can relate. You've been at funerals and it strikes you. I'm finite. I will die one day. And this is his point. It's better to go to a house of mourning, because when you go to a house of mourning, you do the wise thing and realize you will die one day. Frustration is better than laughter, because a sad face is good for the heart. Again, this doesn't seem to make sense on the surface. How can frustration be better than laughter? But in view of what we've been saying, frustration and a sad face arises when you've considered your latter end, when you've considered the fact that you will die. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of pleasure. Now, Kohelet goes into a little bit more description on the house of pleasure and what he thinks about it in chapter 5. At the end of chapter 5, he writes this: "Moreover, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, this is a gift of God. They seldom reflect on the days of their life, because God keeps them occupied with the gladness of heart." He's not saying that a priori wealth and goods and all these sorts of things are bad. What he is saying is they put blinders up. They don't allow you to think through what is correct and true in life. And you're so busy enjoying your wealth and you're so busy enjoying frivolity that you don't stop and consider, I'm going to die one day. And so if you're constantly in the house of pleasure, he's saying that is where the heart of fools go. They don't consider the end. They don't consider the fact they're going to die, but it's in the house of mourning where you do. And this should all start sounding like it's bringing Ecclesiastes together. So what he's saying is, to be wise you need to think about death. You need to start at death and reckon with it. Elsewhere in Ecclesiastes, he said that with wisdom comes much sorrow. And of course, if you're thinking about death, if that's the place that wisdom starts, and you therefore conclude that life is meaningless, that sounds like an awful lot of sorrow to me. And so wealth is a way of avoiding that sorrow. It's a way of not seeing it because you're not thinking about it. This is the nuance and the difficulty that Ecclesiastes really presents here in chapter 7. What makes it so difficult is there's so many different layers and nuances and internal references that are being made. But it is remarkable the level of thought that is evidenced in this chapter. And then in verse 5, it is better to heed the rebuke of a wise person than to listen to the song of fools. And the song of fools goes like this. Like the crackling of thorns under the pot, so is the laughter of fools. This too is meaningless. If you're starting a fire with thorns, it's going to be really loud and it's going to be over really quick. And that's what he's saying is if you're getting advice from people who aren't considering that they're going to die, it's going to be really helpful for a very short amount of time, and then it's going to have ended. All of the fuel, all of the energy, all of the motivation will have gone, and it too, you will find, will be meaningless. I want to push at this point for an application, mainly because, on one hand, because dwelling on abstract philosophical thoughts on death is a recipe for putting people to sleep, but also because I think he's left us with enough material here to strive for an application, to think through what we need to be doing here with this material. It seems unclear at first. You'll recall the book of Psalms, chapter 90. Teach us to number our days so that we may gain a heart of wisdom. The analogy there is quite good, right? You number your days, you're counting them off, and by counting them, you recognize that there's going to be some point at which you stop counting. Brian, a number of months ago, preached a sermon on keeping an eternal perspective. And his point was, in the grand scheme of things, eternity is infinite, and this life is finite. Why would you attach meaning to things in a finite life when infinite life is to come? And Coelette's been a little bit more pragmatic. You're going to die. Why attach meaning to things that are meaningless? The point, though, is exactly the same throughout. If we get fixated and tie value and meaning to things in this finite life, we will be left with the proclamation, absurd, meaningless, pointless. And I want to take that and I want to apply it to myself. I don't want to leave it there. I'm currently working on a PhD. I've been pursuing education for an extremely long period of time. What for? I'm doing it so that I can get a job down the road. But that's looking to the future. That's hoping in the future. How do I proceed about my PhD studies? How do I be a good student? How do I be a good researcher? How do I be a good academic in light of the knowledge, the certain knowledge that I'm going to die? I recently got married. You get married with the view to living with that person forever. How do I be a good husband in view of my certain death? How does that impact my day-to-day life? And I'm going to be honest, and this is going to be disappointing, I don't know. I genuinely do not know. The challenge to me with Ecclesiastes is it dumps that question on you and then leaves you to think about it. And it's really effective writing in that sense, in that it leaves you to think about it and to work it out in your own life. And I don't want to spoil that effect, because I think that effect's important. To consider your latter end. Jesus in the Gospels is speaking to the larger crowds, and he says, "What shall it profit a man, or what shall it profit someone if they gain the whole world and forfeit their own soul? Or what shall someone give in exchange for their soul?" What he's saying is there's a part of you that is eternal, that stands before God. Are you willing to give up that for something that exists here on this world? Let me put it another way. Why did you get out of bed this morning? Why are you going into work on Monday? Have you considered the fact that if it's tied to just this world, your death is going to annihilate everything you worked for? Everything that I am chasing for, everything that I am longing for, will one day end with my death. How do we respond to this? How do we move forward with this? It's almost an existential crisis in some way, and that's kind of the point of this text, is it's leading you into that conclusion. And I want to ask, as the final application, what is the Christian response to this existential crisis? How does Christianity attempt to somehow transcend the meaninglessness and the purposelessness of life? How do we arrive at meaning and value, which I must believe needs to be there? I think the answer is given best of all by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. You'll be very familiar with the chapter. He posits, though, if Christ did not rise from the dead, we are the most to be pitied. And the reason for that, I think, is if Christ was just a moral teacher, if Jesus was just a moral teacher, his life is an absurdity. He spent his life fighting for a moral code, trying to disrupt the religious intolerance that was occurring at the day, fighting for people to get justice, and he dies as a criminal. And any reputation that he got to enjoy, he enjoys after he's dead. I think Colette would conclude from that life, as I've described it, what a waste of life. Absurd. And the Apostle Paul says, if that's all it is, we are the most to be pitied. We're believing in something absurd. But he goes on, doesn't he? But Christ has risen from the dead. And the very thing that proclaimed over his life absurd, he's now crushed. And no longer is the cry, what an absurd waste of life. It's, death, where is your sting? Grave, where is your victory? And he goes on, the Apostle Paul, and the last enemy to be defeated is death. The thing which cries absurd on all we chase after and all we long for is death. But when death has been defeated, there is something which transcends that, which looks beyond it and sees meaning and value and purpose far beyond it, and it lies exclusively in Jesus Christ. And so this morning, if you are struggling for meaning and struggling for purpose and are desperately trying to short-circuit absurdity, hear the words of Jesus Christ this morning. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden and are weary, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. It's a wonderful message, and we've got to witness it from 3 incredible testimonies this morning. I'd ask, if you are not among someone who can say, Jesus Christ is my Savior, put your hope and put your trust in him this morning, and you will find rest for your souls. I'm going to close in prayer and invite the worship team up. Our Heavenly Father, we think of those incredible words in Revelation. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. And that is the cry of Jesus to every single one of us this morning. We confess to you that so often we place our hope and our meaning and our value in things that are finite, in things that have no worth beyond the simple worth we apply to them. We ask, though, that we would hear your knock at the door, and we would turn to you and put our meaning and our value and our hope and our expectations in you and in you alone. We ask that you would keep these things on our mind as we go throughout the week. In the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Calvin. Would you stand and sing one?